Hi everyone, Nicole Martinez with our final case study. Section 1 is to summarize the case and establish the facts. There are three main people in this case: Mr. Richard Inman, who is the assistant principal, and then David and James. As far as ethical and legal issues, ethically, David has had no previous behavior problems or issues of any kind. Mr. Inman believed that the system was broken. David has become a victim to a bully, which was James, and was an otherwise innocent bystander. David's mother hadn't known the policy existed when David went to go talk to Mr. Inman at the school. No one had been physically hurt, but Mr. Inman didn't want this situation to ruin David's future. And Mr. Inman went against the policy and did not end up completing the expulsion paperwork for David. As far as legal issues, felony possession of a prohibited weapon was on school property. They got admitted to a youth detention facility. There is a zero tolerance board policy that requires students to be expelled for no less than 45 days. And then while they're expelled, students will spend their time at the district's disciplinary alternative education program, and it's also referred to as the DAEP. Mr. Inman was required to complete the expulsion paperwork on both students. Section 3 is the case synthesis. Mr. Inman is faced with an ethical dilemma of whether to complete the expulsion paperwork for David or be faced with an official reprimand. But both of these ends up resulting in multiple positive and negative consequences. Section 4 is the synthesis of facts, and this is the people. Mr. Inman, James, David, and the director of secondary education. So again, Mr. Inman is the assistant principal. It's his first year of about 900 students. He fosters positive relationship with students. He grew up in the same area, so he feels like he's more invested in these kids. But he did not complete the expulsion paperwork on David, but he did on James. Going back to James, he is also a student. He's 15 years old. He's a leader of a rough group of students. His behavior and grades have been improving because of his relationship with Mr. Inman. He was the one who gave David the brass knuckles to hold on to throughout the day. And when Mr. Inman contacted James's mother, she was not very concerned about the issues and what they were dealing with. On the other hand, David, who is otherwise innocent in this case, is also a student. He's a young scholar. He participated in honors classes, and he's a standout trombonist in the band. He has no history of behavior trouble, but he was in possession of the brass knuckles when the teacher witnessed the interaction, and his mother was very concerned when Mr. Inman notified her of the incident. And then the other person who is involved pretty heavily is the director of secondary education. He was the one who directed Mr. Inman to follow through with the expulsion paperwork on David. And he told Mr. Inman that he would complete an official reprimand to be included in Mr. Inman's personnel file if he did not comply. This one is the place and program. So synthesis of the facts. The school has around 900 students. It's on the south side of town. It's most likely a diverse population with a large number of students living in poverty. It's probably a suburban area, and the incident occurred in the hallway of the school. The program is at Rocket Junior High. It's probably 7th and 8th grade, although it can range from 6th to 9th grade. It mentioned that it does have extracurricular programs. The two that it listed were band and sports. And then it's also large enough to have an alternative education program, again, DAEP, and it's most likely a public school. Section 5 includes information review and priority, and this is with the stakeholders. So from the student's perspective, is this going to send the wrong message if students find out about the situation? Could they assume the rules won't be followed through if they're broken in the future? Would it be possible that Mr. Inman is perceived as favoring one student over the other, in this case favoring David instead of James? As staff is concerned, would staff members feel differently about Mr. Inman depending on which option he chooses? Are staff members called in to collaborate with possible consequences or with options? So are their voices heard in this situation? With the parents, James's mother was not empathetic towards the situation when Mr. Inman had notified her, but David's mother was extremely emotional and confused. So would it be possible that James's mother would think it's unfair that the boys would receive different consequences for the same action? So James was not in possession, but David was. So would she feel that it was unfair for them to be treated differently? And then the last couple of questions. How are other parents going to respond to the final decision or the situation in general? And will they agree or disagree? And then finally, with the director of secondary education, if Mr. Inman does receive an official reprimand, how will his career be affected in the long term? Will this event create tension between Mr. Inman and other leaders throughout the district or even in his own school? And then section 5 continued. So again, with the students, are both James and David's stories the same? It's possible that when interviewed independently, their stories could change and that could affect the whole entire case. How did James intend using the weapon? And were there any other students involved? As far as staff, is the teacher willing to testify or provide a written statement of what he or she saw in the hallway? Have teachers' opinions or input been evaluated? And is the resource officer involved in any of these conversations or decisions? Technology-wise, are there any cameras in the hallway that could have recorded the events? And then other circumstances, were there any other witnesses at all? Has an ethical issue similar to this one ever occurred before? If so, they can maybe reference what happened. And then how was it handled in the past, and have all options been explored? Section 6 is the identification of options. So I included 3 different options. The first option was to complete the expulsion paperwork. Doing this would be adhering to the board policy. Mr. Inman would complete the expulsion paperwork. However, both James and David will be expelled for a minimum of 45 days and would attend the DAEP. Option 2 would be to not complete the expulsion paperwork. So Mr. Inman would not complete the paperwork for David, but would for James, thus breaking board policy. And the third one would be an alternative consequence. So Mr. Inman would complete the paperwork for James, but formulate an alternative consequence for David. This could include a shorter expulsion time, maybe council lessons or meetings, which I'll talk about in the next slide. And then other options could be a change in the policy, or Mr. Inman could decide to resign completely. Section 7 is the evaluation of these 3 options. So option 1 is to complete the expulsion paperwork. The pros to this option is that Mr. Inman would be upholding school policy and probably the law as well, depending on state regulations. He would not receive an official reprimand on his personnel file, but the cons of this would be that Mr. Inman would be crossing his ethical line. David's reputation and possibly his future would be negatively affected. Option number 2 is to not complete the expulsion paperwork. So he would stand by his morals and ethical decisions, and he would be putting David's well-being first. David would not be required to attend DAEP or be expelled for the minimum of 45 days. He would also be able to return back to school more quickly. The cons of this would be that Mr. Inman would break school policy and possibly the law. He would receive an official reprimand on his personnel file, and his reputation could be at risk in the future. Evaluation of option number 3. This one is with the alternative consequence. So the pros of this is Mr. Inman would be able to stick to his moral compass. He would be able to do what he thinks is best for David's well-being and avoid an official reprimand. David would not have to be expelled for the minimum of 45 days or attend the DAEP. Changing the policy would ensure that this situation does not occur in the future. And then if Mr. Inman resigns, he would not have to deal with the situation any further. But the cons of all of these, it might be difficult for all parties to agree on a fair consequence for David. It could be challenging changing the director of secondary education's opinion or other stakeholders. Changing the policy would be time-consuming work, and it may not even be possible. And that if Mr. Inman resigns, David would most likely have to go through with the expulsion paperwork. He would lose his job, and the policy would remain as it is. Section 8 is to choose the best option. If I were in Mr. Inman's position, I would choose option 3, which would be to complete the paperwork for James, but not for David. I would formulate an alternative consequence for David. Having looked at all of the information, after David's encounter with James, he should have immediately notified a teacher or a trusted adult about the incident. I realized that the window was quite short between the exchange and the call to the office by the teacher, but this would have saved David from more trouble, such as the trouble he's in right now. He did choose to keep the brass knuckles instead of reporting it, so I would suspend David for about 2 or 3 days, or depending on what my colleagues had advised me to do. In addition, if the information was true and James did bully David into performing the action, one of the consequences I would recommend for is to schedule counseling lessons at least once a week to improve David's self-confidence and cultivate the skills to stick up for himself in the future. And then, although a formal reprimand in my personnel file would really bother me, I would feel better about receiving it if it meant that I was able to advocate for a student and make an ethical decision for David. And then I would also work with colleagues to change the current policy so that, again, this does not happen in the future. Section 9 is a continuation of the implementation of decisions. So what could happen as a result? There could be pushback or disagreement for the decision made or for the policy change. Stakeholders could be either in support or not in support of the decision or policy change. And then in worst case scenario, Mr. Inman could be overturned completely. Who needs to know about the information and the decision made? Confidentially, all stakeholders need to know, especially James and David, their parents, the principal, and all staff, or at least the staff involved, the director of secondary education, and then other important community members. Can Mr. Inman handle this situation independently? At this point, I don't think he can, especially with the given people that are involved and the fact that there's a policy change. To warn, not to threaten. It's important to notify the stakeholders and the director of secondary education of the final decision. It's also important to discuss the official reprimand and accept consequences. And then to also discuss other possible consequences such as addressing the issue with higher authority if the director does not agree with it. Also notifying David's mother, and then if she were to seek justice for her son. A plan B, to take the issue to someone higher than the director of secondary education, get other stakeholders on board and in support, and then obviously to accept the official reprimand. Section 10 is the integration and reflection portion. I know I've said before, but administrators' jobs are so tough, and I have even more respect and admiration for them after doing this case study. I also thought this assignment would be a lot easier when I first looked at it, especially since we've spent the bulk of our semester learning about ethical decision-making processes. However, this was much more challenging because of the increased amount of history and background information provided about the principal and the students. If we just looked at the scenario at face value, it would be easier to make a decision because both of the students had been either in possession or involved with the brass knuckles at some point. But I felt like I was more invested in the case, and I'm sure that having a personal connection to your students like Mr. Inman did only makes decisions such as this one all the more difficult. Section 11 is my reference. I really enjoyed working with all of you this semester, and I hope you have a great start to your school year.